Welcome back to another episode of the Freedom Kickstarter podcast. Today we have something a bit different. So it's a first for the podcast. We are going to do a reaction video. So a lot of you might have seen the recent debate on the Diary of a CEO podcast with Daniel Priestley and Gary Stevenson. And I myself had a few fairly strong feelings about it, but also didn't feel like I was exactly the right person to do a critique. So fortunately, we've got someone who is much more qualified in that realm than me. We have my partner, Victoria. So, Victoria, tell us a bit about yourself and why you're qualified to debunk some of what Gary Stevenson says.
Well, I was never a trader. I'm certainly not a trader and never got the bonuses that Gary claims to. But I have been an investment manager or in the investment management world for over a decade, working in the city, managing hundreds of millions of pounds of assets and assisting on billions of pounds worth of assets. So I speak his language. I know where he's coming from when he says things. I understand the angles he's using. So yeah, that's my background. And that's why I felt so passionately when I watched this video. I'd heard a little bit about Gary before, but I kind of ignored him. But it was just when he came onto Diary of a CEO that I thought, no.
Cool. Yeah, so we definitely had some quite interesting conversations about this. And the way we're going to do this video is basically going to watch clips from the original interview and we'll pause them, have a bit of a chat about them. To be honest, there's probably some stuff that we agree with Gary on, but I think most of it's going to be disagree without giving any spoilers away. So we'll dive into it, watch some clips. And yeah, as with anything like this, if you've got any comments of your own, feel free to leave them down below. So yeah, we should dive in with clip number one.
Depends when you define financial security. The issue with house prices,
the ability to raise a family, have a home.
Yeah. So having a home is a big issue, right? So here's what I see with houses, because houses annoy me as well. My dad bought a house for $18,000, which is about £10,000 or less than £10,000, and it's probably worth over $1 million today. So something went on, and this, by the way, is not UK specific. The socialist countries had house prices go through the roof. If you go to Norway or Sweden, their house prices grew by 600%.
It's happening everywhere.
It's everywhere.
It's not specific to anywhere. It's happening everywhere.
But what happened? What has definitely happened in the UK is we actually have a housing traffic jam. So in this country, in the UK, we have 9.5 million homes that have 2 or more spare bedrooms. Big family homes have 2 or more spare bedrooms. And when you look into who owns those houses, 78% of housing wealth is baby boomers. And now, anecdotally, I take my kids trick-or-treating at Halloween, and we go down a street that is big family homes, and you go knock on the doors, and it's all people over 65, right? And they're living in a big family home with empty spare bedrooms.
You think the average American over 65 is living luxuriously?
The average American over 65, so more than half of the US economy is in the hands of baby boomers, right? So they own all the houses. The houses got bought up cheap. Baby boomers still own those houses to this day. The big family homes with multiple spare bedrooms are empty. And now that creates this traffic jam where people my age...
My grandparents,
yeah,
they all owned property. All of them. All 4 of them died with nothing. Because that wealth which they had in property was used in equity release schemes. It was used in paying through their retirement. It was used in end-of-life care. Do you think when those old people die, young people today will be rich?
There is half the economy held by baby boomers. It's either going to be passed down or passed into the aged care industry or passed into... But the issue of why we can't get homes, 2 things. Government massively inflated the value of homes through debt. So they just injected, like low interest rates that you're involved in.
Who is the debt to?
Well, the debt is to anyone who can take out a loan, because if 0% interest rates or 2% interest rates...
Do you think it's the debt to ordinary families? Do you think the ordinary families are the creditors?
When you say ordinary families, you mean bottom third?
So if your average British or American family now has £500,000 of debt,
it's anyone
who has the credit?
It's anyone who could get at that particular time, anyone who could get their hands on a loan to buy a house.
But who has the credit? Who is on the other side of the debt? So if the average British family has £500,000 in debt,
a banking license.
Does the average British family have £500,000 of credit?
Well, a lot of people have got a lot of equity in their home now.
You think the average British family is sitting on £500,000 cash?
I'd love to look at what the actual number is, but it's a couple of 100,000 worth of equity. 78.
But what about the credit on the loan? The credit on the loan. Who owns the credit on the loan?
Bear in mind, it's...
Happy to talk about it from there?
Yeah.
Cool. So what can we pick apart with that?
Well, first of all, let's start. I mean, the most recent thing he's just said there is the cash, the equity. The whole conversation is just a mashup of incorrect terms and showing complete misunderstanding of, how even property ownership works, how equity release, what actually is, as Daniel said, what actually is wealth. What's your view?
I think we can agree that there probably is an issue with housing in terms of, we've talked about this before, in many ways, our generation is very lucky for the opportunities we have. Like anyone can start a business with their phone, stuff in their pocket. It's more accessible than ever to potentially make money. At the same time, it's harder to afford a house. Yes, we spend more on things that we don't necessarily need, in my opinion. But at the same time, you used to be able to buy a house with a smaller percentage of what you earned than you can now.
Yeah.
So I think that I wouldn't disagree with them at all on that.
I don't think we got to hear from Daniel on that, though. I think that's a key point. Daniel was actually trying to do some education there around how this equity and a lot of wealth is locked into homes that are sat on by individuals who don't need them. That doesn't mean that they should have to be forced to release them. If you've lived in a house for 30, 40 years, should you be made to move on? No, absolutely not. But I think Daniel's point there is that there's a lot of wealth locked into homes, and that's why he was talking about the traffic jam in property ownership and why younger generations or those on lower incomes aren't able to access and move up the property ladder. But we get stopped from even sort of having that conversation by Gary's obsession with this: who owns the credit on the loan, and does the average person in the UK or the US have $500,000 in cash? Where's that come from?
Yeah, there seems a fundamental misunderstanding, or maybe deliberate misunderstanding, of what you own in terms of property, which, as you've taught me, is a very illiquid asset, I believe is the term.
Yeah, that's
versus having actual cash, which is
I'm glad
different.
that you've picked that up for me. Thanks, Mike. It's exactly that. With property, if you wanted to release some of that, do you sell a brick? No, you don't. Of course, there's equity release schemes that are available, but property is illiquid because if you think about the length of time that it takes to sell property, how you can sell it, as I say there, you don't sell a brick. Whereas if you have an investment portfolio, for example, you can sell a share, you can sell a unit. So property is incredibly illiquid. And just on that point, actually, as well, they haven't really touched on it here. But I think this obsession in our worlds of property ownership is really troubling. If we look at the UK in particular, this is a bit of a phenomenon that's only really in the UK. Yes, other Western countries are inspired to own homes. But if we look at Europe, home ownership is much, much lower than it is in the UK. And the sort of obsession with owning your own home that is driven, I think it's a political thing a lot of the time, is driven into people's minds is just not a thing over in Europe, or less so anyway. And I think this idea that stability or wealth can only come from home ownership is so wrong. I do understand the desire to have your own home. It does feel it feels like you don't have someone who's dictating when you can live there, when you have to leave, these sorts of things. The things you can do to a property to adjust it to your tastes. But as someone who does own a property, and I have done for about a decade or so, very lucky to do so, but it also held me back in many, many ways that my friends who didn't own property weren't held back at that stage of their life. So I think this obsession with the only way that you can prosper in life, have stability and build wealth is through property ownership is just completely wrong.
I think maybe I'm reading more into this than Gary is saying, but it's almost like he's saying if you bought a property at the right time, you kind of should be punished for that in a sense. And like if you, as you said, if you own a big home and you've got some equity you can release there and you've got bedrooms you aren't using, the insinuation seems to be that, you shouldn't have that. And just because you bought it at a good time, it's almost like going back 10 years and penalising someone for buying Bitcoin back then when, everyone had the opportunity to do it. Some people did, some people didn't. And just because you've profited from getting something at the right time doesn't mean that you should be suffering any consequence by having to give up some of it now.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's go for the next clip.
Where wealth is being extracted out of the middle class, out of the working class, very, very rapidly. It's benefiting people like the three of us at this table. It will benefit our kids. Our kids will be rich, their kids will be poor. And I just think we should be honest with them. Capitalism's finished. We won. Well done, Stephen. Well done, Daniel. Well done, Gary. It's over now. Our kids will be rich. Their kids will be poor. They'll pay the taxes. We won't pay the taxes. We'll avoid it. I'll make money betting on it year after year. Why are we lying to them? Why are we lying to them?
Yeah, I think that's an overly simplified view of things.
It's an overly simplified view of things that has made me a multimillionaire.
Yeah, well, look, entrepreneurs take bets on the economy as well. We take bets differently. When we start a company, we're betting on how the economy
the average
would be.
British and American worker at the 50th percentile, do you think their kids will be richer than they are?
It depends if we have economic freedom or not, right? We're going to have a split test on this.
Do you think we will?
Right. We're going to have a split test. We're going to have, the UK seems like we're going to have more taxes, more regulations. And it seems like the US is going to have less taxes and less regulations. Here's what I've noticed. I've noticed that places like Singapore that have small governments have got widespread affluence. There's not a lot of poverty in Singapore.
Yeah, except for the cleaners living in the closets, yeah.
You know, look...
But we don't count them in the statistics, just like we don't count our viewers.
That's not widespread in Singapore.
Well, there's a lot of people... I've seen them in the closets. I've seen them in the closets.
There are some...
But they're not Singaporeans.
Well, also...
We only count the rich ones.
Look, the issue is that they've come from even worse conditions in many cases. People move to Singapore for an increase in lifestyle, right? You could take Ireland or Switzerland, right? Economically free places. Ireland was economically in a disaster.
Do you think the average Irish person lives well?
Well, their economy
50th
almost
Irish person lives well.
Their economy almost collapsed in 2011, and they went down the road of lower taxes, lower regulations, and they attracted all sorts of businesses into the economy.
And do you think that works well for the average Irishman who doesn't own a home in Dublin?
If you measure everything by home ownership...
I'm measuring people by the average. I want to know what the average man or woman...
So I think my point there, well, a couple of bits. One, I think he's arguing in very bad faith. I think he's arguing purely emotively, purely on his personal anecdote, which there's a time and a place for using personal anecdote, and we all do it, and it's not to say that's a completely invalid argument, but to talk about I've seen cleaners living in closets in Singapore is a very bizarre way to do it. And whether you like it or not, there will always be a hierarchy in society, even with what it seems like he's pushing for, which is a more socialist structure. And I'd argue wanting absolute equality is going far beyond that. Even with those structures, you still have a hierarchy. It's the whole, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others from Animal Farm, which, I mean, my personal view is that that's a horrendous way to live. So I find it very odd that he's trying to, first of all, he's talking about the average person, and then he's going back and talking about the lower rung is not the way to put it from a human life perspective, but people at the lower end of the economic spectrum. I find that very bizarre way to argue, and it's done in very bad faith, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't know with with this whole thing. I don't know what annoys me more, whether it's the lack of points that he makes. I was going to say the points he makes. It's the lack of points he makes, or if it's the desire to just trample across the whole discussion and stop any genuine learning opportunity for people or genuine discussion. I was listening. I had the good fortune to have a nice journey up here to this lovely studio and was listening to 4 or 5 hours of his book. So I haven't finished it, I have to say. I've only listened to the first third, let's say. He's a great actor. He's a great storyteller. He's funny. And as someone who came from, let's say, a similar background to him, perhaps not exactly the same, don't let the accent fool you, but roughly a similar background, and also kind of made it into the city, or he was in Canary Wharf, I was in the city, the Square Mile, or am in the city. I do see a lot of what he says does resonate. So there's a lot of truth then. There's a lot of help that he could give if he was genuine about this desire to engage in conversation, to come up with some good ideas, to progress things for, the struggling classes in the UK, which at the moment is all of them, other than the high net worth and ultra high net worth individuals who, as we've talked about, aren't here anymore because they're off in far nicer places paying far less tax. So I think, I don't know what annoys me more, if it's the lack of genuine care to engage in the debate, or if it's the completely pointless, questions that aren't actually there to elicit a response, or it's just there for kind of humour, which if that's your humour, then yeah, right.
And I think the other thing I find funny, and we might disagree on this slightly, is his idea of the average person. Because to me, I think you can say, yes, potentially, it's not right now that the average person generally can't work a 9 to 5 and support a family. You know, you can't earn the average wage or even slightly above the average wage, in a couple and have only one of you work.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the average person now has the most advanced technology ever in their pocket. Even people who earn, a very low wage typically have a very advanced iPhone in their pocket. We've never had more access to healthy food, never had more access to gyms. People would definitely spend more from their disposable income on things like cars and things like clothes. People's social lives so much better, access to all around the world. Yes, that costs money, but I think if you purely look at it at, well, as he seems to go for, a home ownership standpoint, it's a very odd way to judge it. The average person, yes, there are some things that are worse than, let's say, the 50s and 60s. But go back further than that, I think if you ask most people on the street, would you rather be an average person in 2025 or would you rather be an average person in 1653? Most people are going to say, and I've gone back a long way there, but most people are going to say I'd rather be an average person now than, a century ago.
Yeah, no, you're right. And there are elements that I agree with you on there and elements that I disagree. We've had conversations many a time over the dinner table around that. But I think the sort of overall point that you make there, I completely agree with. It's not right that the average income in the UK, I don't know so much about the US, in the UK can't afford certain things. I think there's perhaps areas of society that genuinely, they don't have the latest outfits. They're not driving flash cars. I talk to you a lot about people who, as their income increase their spending and don't, really keep a lid on that. They try and live up to the social media lifestyle. But I think there probably are, well, not probably, there are people who are genuinely struggling to get by day to day. But what I would come back to is, and I think Daniel, before we stopped the clip there, was about to come back to it, is this fascination with simply everything coming down to property ownership. I don't get it, but I think it's a political thing from Gary. He had said, get political, be political. So, he's politically minded. And that is, hooking onto the fact that in the UK, we are drummed into having this belief that the be-all and end-all is property ownership to build wealth, build prosperity, and live comfortably and stably.
Yep, exactly. Cool. We should go for the next clip.
Are we seeing that now with this, they call it the millionaire exodus, which is, for people that don't know, the UK is set to lose the greatest proportion of millionaires in the world this parliament. I'll put a graph on the screen, which is this one here. And that little red line here is us losing all of our millionaires at the moment. And in 2024, it's estimated that 10,800 high net worth individuals left the UK, which is a 157% increase from the previous year, which means that 1 millionaire is departing every 45 minutes. The UK millionaire exodus is equal to losing 530,000 average taxpayers. And another stat, the top 10% of earners in the US account for nearly half of all consumer spending. The top 1% of income taxpayers in the UK are projected to contribute about 30% of total income tax from 2024 to 2025. Why are all these millionaires running away?
Well, it's not because they're taxing their wealth, because we don't have any wealth taxes.
Why do you think they're leaving?
I think the reason they're leaving is because the UK economy is really, really weak. Because the UK consumer is really, really weak. Because we've absolutely crushed the spending power of your average British family.
And where are they
going? Your average
going?
British family can barely afford to feed the kids and turn the heating on. So why are you going to start a business here when the customers are absolutely impoverished?
Cool. So I think there'll be a few bits to unpack in that bit, and I've stopped it there. We'll play the clip on a bit afterwards as well, because there's even more. But for me, there's a lot going on in there again, I think. And I'm going to do something here that I just criticised Gary for doing, which is using personal anecdote. But I've seen, even just in my sort of fairly small circle, a lot of people the last 5 years have left the UK because they're just getting, it's almost, I don't want to say pointless, but it's getting less and less enjoyable to run a business when you see so much of your profits that are hard won being taxed. And he talks about...
But of course, we don't have wealth taxes, according to Gary.
Yes, which just I find bizarre, because he's saying they're not leaving because of wealth taxes, but then he wants to put wealth taxes in, which surely is going to make even more of them leave, which I find absolutely absurd. And it's this whole idea of the fact that by getting rid of wealthy people or by taxing them more, which is going to cause them to leave, the economy is going to improve because then somehow people lower down the economic spectrum are going to have more disposable income. I'm like, that's madness. Like, how much more do you want to have? Someone who's got, let's say, I don't know, £500 of disposable income a month. If we put in wealth taxes and redistribute that, what are they going to have now? £600? Like, it's not enough to grow the economy.
I think also this idea that the government taking money from these individuals who are leaving is somehow then going to spur, and this is a key sort of theory in economics, as Gary will know, the idea that that's going to somehow spur those who are struggling to, I think he says they're paid for their electricity and their water or their heating bills, to suddenly spend it. If that's your theory, you're completely deluded. The idea that the government, regardless, and this isn't a party, I'm not sort of referencing any particular party here, the idea that the government is going to use that money in such a way and it's actually going to be efficient and work is laughable. Absolutely laughable.
Yeah, it reminds me slightly of the Simpsons clip where Mr. Burns stands on a roof and throws down money but decides to throw down coins and everyone gets hit by them on the way down. I could sort of, couldn't imagine, well, naturally, I could imagine Keir Starmer throwing down coins onto people. But anyway, that's a separate topic. But yeah, this whole notion that by just stringently taxing wealthy people, that the middle class get richer enough to grow the economy, it's just laughable, really.
Yeah, and the idea as well that, and as you say, you're using their personal anecdote of individuals that you know or we know, but the idea that people are leaving, I think he said there because consumers aren't spending or something like this. Consumption, it's pretty strong. Like, growth in the UK is not at all good, but consumption itself is really not so much of an issue. So the idea that business owners are leaving because they're not making money from their businesses in the UK, that's just a non-point there completely. It's all to do with taxation and the fact that I think, if individuals saw that who have left to the likes of, let's say, Dubai, because that seems to be the hotspot at the moment, if individuals saw that money improving the UK, improving living standards, not just for themselves, but for others, they saw it in the roads, they saw it on the streets, they saw it in their communities, I don't think there would be such an exodus that Stephen is referencing there. I think the issue is that money isn't going to these things. So why would you stay around and give away half of your income to go absolutely nowhere and help absolutely no one?
Yeah, and I know that from what I've seen, the Scandinavian countries score quite highly on happiness indexes, but they have fairly high tax rates. And that's because things just tend to work. Okay, not for every single individual, but on a large scale basis, as you say, the money you pay gets spent on things to make society better. Yeah. And someone will probably pick me up on the exact stats here, but I believe it's something like 1 millionaire leaves the UK on average every 45 minutes.
Sounds right.
Which is, that's a lot of people leaving. And you look at our economic growth, I think, again, stats could be slightly off here, but I think the last couple of years we've been around sort of 0.1% in terms of GDP growth. You look at somewhere like Poland, last year I think they were 2.9, this year predicted something like 3.4. They've got very favourable structures and tax rates.
We've just got that from Vietnam. Had really interesting conversation there with two Western business owners. And Vietnam is... Oof.
And actually, you look at how this is a slightly off topic, but you look at their approach to entrepreneurship. We were in Book Street in Ho Chi Minh, and I was amazed at how many business and self-development books there were. And it's almost like they're encouraging it. And that's not an economic thing, that's maybe a societal or cultural thing. But their approach to entrepreneurs seems to be much more like,
give it a go.
Yeah, you go for
make
it. You
something
start
of yourself.
Whether you're coming here, whether you're starting it as a Vietnamese national, but it just seems so much more conducive to earning well, by which that does grow the economy, and it's that whole rising tide lifts all boats type analogy. Yeah. Cool. I'll keep rolling. I think there'll be a bit more here as well.
We ended the non-dom scheme. So the non-dom scheme basically said if you're living in the UK but you've got businesses all over the world, then we only tax you on what you've got in the UK. And if you die in the UK, we'll only tax you on your UK assets for inheritance tax if you're a non-dom. But if you die in the UK and you've got wealth in India, once that non-dom scheme ended, they basically said, we will tax you on everything globally. If you're if you're a tax resident in the UK, everything you've got globally, we want 40% of it. So unfortunately, every wealth manager contacted their clients and said, you can't stay here. You're going to have to get out. It's gotten really bad. 1,000 people a month are leaving. And in the UK, 1% of people pay 30% of the taxes, 10% of people pay 60% of the taxes. And you imagine if we're sitting out at dinner and there's 10 of us out to dinner and one person says, hey, I've got this, I'll get 60% of the bill tonight. We say to them, no, it should be 70%, it should be 80%. And they say, you know what, I'll get up and leave. So they leave, everyone else's bill just doubled. So what's going to happen is if we drive the millionaires out of this country, every ordinary normal person who pays 10 grand a year in tax will now have to pay 20 grand a year in tax.
So the reason they left it because we used to allow them to not pay tax. And
on their global incomes, on their global
So isn't it a bit
businesses.
more like if we were 10 of us at dinner and there was one guy who came to dinner on the condition he wouldn't pay, then leaves? Because these guys weren't paying tax anyway. If the reason they left is because they weren't paying tax.
Do you want to go for it, or do you want me to kick this off?
You go. I'm still trying to process what Gary's struggling to process.
To me, this is like, I've heard Daniel give this analogy before where he talks about when you get on a flight, you might think, oh, posh bastards up in first class, you might moan about them. They're actually subsidising the rest of the plane because an airline needs to make a certain amount of money per flight. And okay, you could argue they should make less profit, but it's a business. And those people in first class are paying an astronomical amount more than people in economy. If you made the whole flight economy, everyone who flew would have to pay more. And it's the same idea here that we need a certain amount of money to keep the economy going. And I don't even want to get into government misspending with this because that's something that annoys me to high heaven. And you could talk about black holes. They don't know where money's gone, and just again, I won't get started on lockdown because we'll be here for 3 hours with my rants on the damage that did to the economy. But it's this idea that people are just going to stick around if you tax their wealth. Like Daniel said, it's a different scenario because that person at dinner saying, I'm going to cover 60% of everyone's bill, that's someone being deliberately very generous and going out of their way, whereas taxes are a legal thing. But everyone has a tipping point. And we know from like our conversations, I've said it multiple times and more so recently, even for someone like me who is not absolutely minted, I'm not even running a 7-figure business, but I'm getting to the stage where I'm thinking, if it wasn't for family, I would be out of here and I would happily pay more for things. I'd happily end up with the same amount of money in my pocket every single month if I knew that less was going to the government.
Yeah. And I think here Daniel's talking about the non-dom scheme as well, which is so important that Gary's not giving credit to, in that taking a little bit of something is better than taking nothing of nothing. To touch on the non-dom scheme point, that was to have individuals in the UK with their wealth. Yes, you're only taxing them on their UK wealth, but that was the whole point. Because if individuals aren't here, 0% of 0 is nothing. We want to tax something for sure. Like, we shouldn't not be taxing people at all. But I don't understand why Gary can't see that. It's odd that he can't see how not having a scheme like that in place is of no benefit to us.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Cool. I'll keep it rolling.
It's like saying, hey, I'll pay 60% of this table. And they say at the table, hey, wait a second, we also want you to pay for everything that's happening at other restaurants as well.
Isn't it a bit more like these guys
and we're stretching the analogy
on a condition? You yourself said.
No, you're 100%
the reason why they left is because we let them live here on the condition that they didn't have to pay taxes.
On their global, taxes matter, right? So why is everyone going to Dubai? Dubai, they're going there because there's no tax.
These guys, they live in Dubai. Their money comes from the West. They are making money from the West, while your average Western ordinary person watching this show now cannot afford to buy a house, cannot afford to have a family. We can tax those revenues at the point of sale. Why do we allow these guys?
It's called a consumption tax.
No, it's not. It's a tax on profits. It's not a tax on consumption.
You just said at point of sale, which means it's a consumption tax.
Based on the profits. You look at how much profit they have,
that's not
and
a
then you work
consumption
out where the profits go. Exactly, it's not a consumption tax.
I just love this bit because a tax at the point of sale is absolutely not a tax on profit. You have no idea how much profit someone is making from that.
Yeah.
A business can be making a massive loss and still have a point of sale tax. It's like why, you could do over, is it 85k, 90k a year now, the VAT threshold? You can make a loss in your business but still have to pay VAT.
Yeah.
I'm not a tax expert in any way whatsoever. I'm slightly financially illiterate, even, I would say. And even I go, hold on, that's absolutely not the same thing. I don't know if that's willful ignorance or if that is just maybe just getting so caught up emotionally. I'm not sure.
No, I think to give Gary his due here, these aren't his areas. Okay, so I think there's been this idea that because Gary has said that he was the best trader in the world or something like this for Citibank, that he therefore is the messiah when it comes to anything to do with personal finance, tax, economics, geopolitics even. A trader is very different to, let's say, an economist. Again, very different to a tax advisor, very different to a wealth manager that Daniel referenced. These are all very different areas with very, very specific knowledge and expertise. So I wouldn't expect a trader, all the traders, I wouldn't expect a trader to know all of these different things. But the point is, if you're going to make your living, which, let's be honest, that's all Gary's doing, he's just making a buck or two, make your living off of having discussions like this, and you're going to go on one of the biggest podcasts or the biggest podcast, maybe after Joe Rogan?
Probably the biggest in the UK.
Then you should be knowing what you're talking about. You should understand. You can see that Daniel, either from just general experience or quite rightly, has brushed up on things prior to the podcast, knows what he's talking about. He's got the numbers. He gets it. Whereas Gary, fair enough, you're a trader, so you don't know these things. But if you're going to go on a podcast and you're going to sort of teach the nation, bloody brush up. Christ.
Yeah, I think there'll be even more here, so I'm going to keep it rolling. We'll see what comes up.
Assumption tax, like I'm saying.
So if you tax profits, right, then those profits have to accumulate in that country. And because of the digital ecosystem that we now have, the world we now live in, I can lease the database off of my company in Luxembourg. I can license my logo from a company.
I understand how profit shifting works.
Go on.
Okay, listen, these guys are not Gandalf. You just say, we don't accept profit shifting. We don't need to accept profit shifting. China does not accept profit shifting. We did not accept profit shifting 50 years ago. We do not have to accept profit shifting. But you have a government class who are extremely wealthy and a media class who are extremely wealthy saying it's impossible to tax rich people. And I would like to say, I will agree 100%. It is difficult to tax rich people.
Yeah.
It is very, very, very difficult to tax rich people.
The difference...
I don't come here saying I want to tax rich people because it's easy. I know it's hard. I know probably I'm going to lose. I know our viewers' kids will live in desperate poverty. I know that. I do this because it is hard.
Two things here. I think, first of all, I wasn't going to touch on this and it just came up, but our viewers' kids will live in desperate poverty. I very much struggle to believe that someone is in desperate poverty if they have facility to watch a YouTube video. That's just my take. You can be in relative poverty, potentially, but desperate poverty, again, there's a difference between relative poverty and absolute poverty. And I just don't think you'd be watching this if you're in desperate poverty. But my other point being, this idea of tax the rich. Well, first of all, it's how much tax. And I think this is where people really fall down. And it's part of it's the politics of envy. It's never, I want to help the poor. It's always, I want to tax the rich. And maybe that's a generalization on my part, but I don't ever see people framing it the other way. But this idea of tax them, well, how much more? People say, oh, they should pay their fair share. Well, what's fair? Everyone wants things to be fair. Everyone has a different definition of fair. And then it's the rich thing. And I know that, I think for me, Jordan Peterson summed up really well when he said most people, when you dig it down into it, they see the rich as anyone with more money than them.
I was just about to say this because, interestingly, Gary talked about the billionaires, but then he also talks about those, and, correct me here because I can't quite remember it. Is it with revenue or with net assets greater than 10 mil? I'll look that up and we'll put it down below. But he references that. And, I look at Gary, and if what he said about his bonuses and things are true, I wasn't in trading, which is within the sort of sphere of financial services in London, is one of the best, if not the best paid areas of it. I wasn't in that. I look at Gary and I think, you're bloody rich. So why is the barrier for wealth or rich just conveniently above where Gary is?
It's almost like could be doing him a disservice here, but it feels like he's speaking on behalf of companies rather than individuals. And there's other bits, whether we'll catch these in this or not, I don't know. But it's almost like he doesn't see individuals within companies. And he talks about taxing company wealth, not realizing that individuals are still tied to that, business owners, shareholders, that kind of thing. So yeah, I find the whole thing very bizarre that it's very easy to make an emotive argument when you're not putting
anything behind it.
Yeah, there's no quantifiable term around it.
Yeah.
Because if you said to someone, do you think very wealthy people should pay their fair share? No one's going to disagree with that. But then, like I said, it's entirely ambiguous as in what is very wealthy, what is rich, what's their fair share.
Yeah. And I think Gary is very good at sort of dramatizing the conversation, dramatizing the debate. There's elements of comedy in there. He's an animated character. But I see online, he makes some good points. What points? Other than tax the rich, there isn't any point in there. I would love to hear it. We desperately need for the struggling classes in the UK. US viewers as well, they reference here, but my experience is the UK. So we desperately need advocates. And he's bright. He's very clearly an intelligent person with good experience. So we need people like that advocating for those who are struggling and to improve society, to improve communities, to sort the government out. We need that. That's not happening here.
Yeah, I think everyone wants, by and large, every single person in the UK to be better off.
Yeah.
And we do often just disagree on the best way to go about it, but I can't see any way that his reasoning so far is actually going to do that.
No.
Growth media company, and it's worth 11 million, right? So we could come up with a forecast and a projection, and we say Gary's Economics is actually a new fast growth media brand. It's worth 11 million. Now, your channel, now you have to pay 100 grand a year in extra taxes because you're a millionaire.
Well, sorry, 1% on wealth above 10 million on 11 million is going to be 10 grand of taxes.
Oh, you're saying only on the part above?
That's how taxes work.
So it's not on everything. It's okay. So it's a marginal tax.
That's how taxes work.
It's above. But is it fair that who gets to decide what wealth is wealth and what it's worth? Because wealth, let's just hear me out. Wealth is a technical term for unrealized gains, right? It's not real. Someone buys a house for 20 grand and it's worth 200 grand. They've still got the same house, but now they've got wealth. If someone starts a business and a tiny little seed investor puts in a little angel investment, now they've got wealth on paper. But who gets to say what is wealth? For example, if you introduce wealth taxes, theoretically, that will actually reduce the value of wealth of things anyway, because the things inside that economy are now subject to a disadvantage. So therefore, investors will be unlikely to invest in them to a certain point. And also, people start cutting and dodging and weaving and ducking and weaving. So they say, our UK operation's worth 10 million, so we're now going to start a second company over in some other country and make sure that's where the wealth accumulates. So it's incredibly difficult because it is just unrealized gains.
I know it's difficult.
Yeah.
I know these guys have the best accountants. I know it's difficult.
So what if there was an easier solution?
If there was an easier solution, I would support that. You know what I mean?
It's called economic freedom. The economic freedom index.
Just tell the viewers that. Give them more economic freedom and then they'll be rich.
Yeah, so this diagram here basically says the most free countries have less than 10% poverty, in fact, less than 7% poverty. As soon as you reduce economic freedom, it jumps to 30% poverty. You reduce economic freedom again, and it jumps up to huge amounts of poverty. So these countries here are the least economically free, and these countries are the most economically free. The countries that get in the way of your economic freedom have more poverty, and the countries that let people make decisions for their own life.
So what you're saying is, if the governments of our countries cut taxes on us, the 3 multimillionaires sitting at this table, that will improve the lives of the ordinary British and American worker.
I'll give you a real-life
who can't
example.
afford to feed their kids.
I'll give you a real-life example. I know of a company that was going to give pay rises to its employees, and then national insurance went up, and instead of giving...
National insurance is a tax on employment.
Yeah.
I'm saying to reduce that. I'm saying to reduce tax on... I want your viewers, the viewers here, to be paying less tax, whilst multimillionaires pay more tax.
It's good in theory, but if you could tax rich people 1% of their wealth above 10 million... I did a back of a napkin calculation. You might be able to get 20 billion.
Yeah.
Right? That's if they don't leave. That's if they don't respond to it. If they just happily pay it, you get 20 billion. Okay. That's less than a week worth of current government spending.
I think the idea there as well is something that I've brushed up on a bit, and it's my sort of word of the week, but the Laffer curve, in terms of generally the less you tax, the more you actually gain, because two reasons. One, rich people, to use that term, just don't leave because there's no incentive for them to go. And secondly, they don't try as hard to get around it. Setting up, as Daniel was saying earlier, like licensing in a different country in order to pay less tax. I would imagine, never done it, but I imagine it's quite an involved process. It probably costs a lot through accountants, through setting up different companies, all that kind of thing. If you only would bother to do that if you're really suffering financially because of the government imposed taxes. So it's one of those things where, again, I think it's lovely in theory to believe that you could whack up every multi-millionaire and billionaire's taxes by 10%, take all that extra money that's been generated and then give it into the economy. As Daniel says, it actually doesn't add up to that much in the grand scheme of things. But I believe that Gary thinks that people are just autonomous beings who just do everything theoretically. And we know that doesn't happen. Humans are emotive, they respond in different ways, and it's not just as simple as this calculation would make sense, because people will just up and leave.
I think the Laffer curve is so interesting as an economic theory or principle. Gary will no doubt know about it. He, as an economist, he should. And it's a dot graph that shows a sort of tail off in the revenue that's generated from taxes as you increase those taxes. The point being that governments or whoever's charging these taxes are needing to find that sort of perfect balance of taxing enough that things can be covered. Completely agree, as they've said on the podcast, that taxes should be paid. But it's finding that perfect sweet spot where you can get the tax, but you don't drive people away. I think, Laffer curve's really interesting one to look into.
Yep.
So the government's out of control. 1.2 trillion a year of government spending is now what they spend.
Okay, so let's get that 20 billion and cut the taxes for the viewers. Cut their income
so
taxes.
That works out about 250 a year.
Okay, so let's do more. Let's make it 60 billion.
So then you tax 3% above wealth.
Yeah, do that.
Right, and then you also bring it down.
Bear in mind,
this is what governments do.
We make 5 or 6%. Yeah, and that's what they did.
You know what they do?
That's what they did in the Second World War, and that's...
This bit I just find so frustrating and infuriating. And it's not really actually what they're saying. It's more the lack of care to do any research and to actually have any thought behind what you're saying and your ideas and your principles. Great, have them. We need people with plans and ideas and putting input into the government as to how things can improve, how things can change. But to just sit there and flippantly go, yeah, great, that. Yeah, cool, that. Yeah, great. What are you doing? What is that? That isn't anything that's well thought out. And it comes across as so fake and so inauthentic, as genuinely caring for people. It just comes across as, I found my way onto a podcast and I'm going to bluff my way through it, with no actual genuine care as to how things can be implemented. Bring ideas to the table. Daniel's brought graph after graph after graph and data points. I've heard none of that from Gary. Disappointing.
And I think equally, something that Daniel said, that I will butcher the quote here, but it's from Thomas Sowell, where he says about, I've never understood how it's greed to want to keep your own money, but not greedy to want to take it off those who've earned it.
Yeah.
And I know there are companies that do unethical things, and I know that hard work does not equal wealth. You can work very, very hard your whole life, end up with nothing. Unfortunately, that does happen, and people probably hate me for saying this, but that's kind of life. Bad things happen to good people, and good things happen to bad people. But by and large, people who are wealthy have worked hard for it. And, they might have got a bit lucky, but then luck is just when, what's the phrase, opportunity meets preparation. So you've had to do the preparatory work as well. But it's just the notion that, I would imagine that Gary would agree that governments are very, very wasteful with money. Why not fix that before you start taking money off other people?
Yeah.
I've never understood that argument of, we hate the government, but we want higher taxes. It's like, we hate the school bully, but we want them to get more money off the kids by, holding them up by their legs and shaking out the lunch money. It's like...
The water's just going out the bath tub without a plug in it.
Yeah, fix the leak in the bath rather than getting people to come and get buckets to chuck it back in. So that's just my point. I can completely understand people wanting... Well, I can't completely understand it, but I get an argument for wanting higher taxes if that money is distributed correctly. But we know
that's not going to happen.
No, you don't have to be on either side of the political aisle to think that government is very wasteful with spending.
World War, and that's why my dad could afford a house.
That's not why he could afford a house.
Okay, all right, well, who's buying... If ordinary people are losing their houses and the wealth, which they are, and we're getting richer.
Yeah.
Who is it who is now owning the houses if it is not us?
The government used to own the houses, and then they sold
Government wealth is collapsing.
No,
government wealth
I know,
is collapsing.
But what they did is they sold the houses to the people.
Okay, but
Right?
ordinary middle class wealth is also collapsing.
You can only do that once. And they did it for the baby boomers.
So you think it's our viewers who have got more houses now? Where is the wealth going, Daniel? Where is the wealth going? Who has the wealth now? Who is getting richer? Who is getting the wealth that is lost by our viewers?
I'll tell you where the biggest amounts of money are going. The biggest amounts of money since the pandemic, 11 trillion went just to the value of 7 companies that own technology.
Yeah. Stephen, if you allow British people who own 300 million pounds of British assets to technically live in Monaco and not pay tax, then you will get crime, and you will have dirty streets, and you will have a bad healthcare system, and you will have education. Because if you give all of the wealth to a group of people who do not tax, there will be nothing left to provide things like healthcare and education for ordinary people. It's not unconnected.
These people are not technically living there. They're moving out. My friends have moved out of the country. They don't come back to the UK. They've left, and they leave with their companies.
So they built a company here.
No, they typically build globally
and pay no tax.
They typically build globally business.
Okay.
It's not that they
Yeah,
pay.
it was a global
and also,
business.
They don't pay no tax. They pay extortionate amounts of tax. Right? Anyone who's here is paying extraordinary taxes, more than they've ever paid before. 1% pays 30%. 10% pays 60% of 1.2 trillion a year worth of government spending.
300 million. How much tax do you reckon he's paid in his life?
I have no idea. His business was global, though. His biggest customer was the US.
Because I pay 60%, and our viewers will pay 30, 40, 50%. Do you think it's fair that your 300 million guy pays his 2 or 3?
I have no idea what he pays.
Well, it sounds like he didn't pay 50%.
Well, he dashed before he got the tax bill.
But why do we allow it? Why do we allow it? I'm not allowed to not pay my tax.
What could you have done to...
You are allowed to. When you were in Japan, you wouldn't have paid UK taxes.
Yeah, because I was working in Japan, and then I paid Japanese taxes.
Yeah, because you were living in Japan. This is the thing. People can live wherever they want now.
But we're talking about... I think we should stop obfuscating tax on people's work from tax on the assets that they own.
So I'm talking about entrepreneurs' work generates wealth. So
if I earn £1 billion of British houses...
Yeah.
And then I say I live in Dubai, and I'm getting the rent on £1 billion of houses, which would probably be something like, that's going to be something like £50 million a year. So I'm getting 50, 60 million pounds a year of rent from British people.
Yeah.
And that gets paid to me from British people.
Yeah.
And I don't pay tax, so I live in Dubai. Do you think that's fair?
No.
All right, so let's change that. Let's make people pay tax on their wealth, regardless of where they live.
Yeah, the question would be, though, how would you tax people, right? And how would you actually structure it? Because regardless of what you feel like is fair, this is the thing. It's not about fairness. It's about what you can pragmatically and practically do in the modern economy. Yeah. You might say, like, for example, if we said what's fair, a lot of people would say a flat tax is fair. You make £1, you pay 20%. You make £1 million, you pay 20%. You make £100 million, you pay 20%. So a lot of people would say the fairest tax system would just be a flat tax on everything, right? That would be a fair thing. It's pragmatically, can you do it? Is it actually good for society? Should people be excluded from that? So it's not about fairness. It's about pragmatically, what can you get away with?
All right, well, pragmatically, what we can get away with is desperate poverty for our viewers' kids.
If you want to have... Can we zoom out just a minute, right? I want to zoom out.
Let's zoom away from our viewers' kids. Forget about them. They're not that important.
I'm a dad, right? I got 3 kids.
But you are a multi-millionaire dad.
Do you know...
You probably don't have the same problems as our viewers.
Do you know that kids born into the top...
Sorry, just quickly, this really pisses me off because a lot of the time people go on about, mental health problems affect everyone. He has absolutely no idea what Daniel may or may not be going through. And I'm sure there isn't anything major, but there could be. I just find that absurd that the people who generally preach kindness and acceptance and that kind of thing, also, when it comes to rich people, just completely dismiss their problems.
And another one is, the check your privilege. They're the first ones to tell people about their privilege and to check their privilege without doing so themselves. So check your privilege, Gary.
Yep.
Have a 60% chance of dropping out of the top, right? 60%. That's the number. It's called persistence. You can Google it. The persistence rates is actually only 40% for the richest, which means 60% drop out in the second.
Do you think your kids have a 60% chance of living in poverty?
Also, not poverty.
Do you know what's interesting? Though? We're all trying to aim at the same goal.
That just makes no sense. That's just a clickbaity question designed to sort of cover up not knowing what to say next. There's nothing to that. It doesn't help the conversation. It's just clickbait.
I think here.
I'm not sure we are, boss.
Well, I mean, that's fair. That's fair. Maybe we're
I
not.
suspect some of us
We're
are
not.
maybe trying to protect our kids'
No, I
wealth
want
position.
I want widespread affluence through the technological revolution that's
Okay.
happening, and I don't want the people who create that to want to go somewhere else.
So you agree with me that we should cut tax on wealth creators and raise tax on wealth hoarders?
Well, broadly.
Okay, so let's do it.
But if
Let's
you-
cut
no,
tax
sorry,
on people
sorry.
who are making income.
Sorry,
let's
broad-
cut tax on people who are working hard, creating a good product, making a good income, and let's raise tax on people who are sitting there on 20, 30, 40, 100, 200, 500 million pounds of assets that they're going to give to their kids and they're going to use to dominate society and squeeze out the middle class.
So who's an example of someone who's hoarding wealth?
Rishi Sunak.
So his family owns a tech company.
His wife's dad owns a tech company.
That's what I mean.
Which he will inherit and his kids will inherit.
But his net worth that is quoted is based upon his wife's.
Yeah, but that company already exists.
Yeah.
It's created now.
Yeah.
It's
But
worth billions.
But they have to reinvent that business every 2 years. Like it's a
So you think that you think that if Rishi Sunak's father-in-law stopped managing the company, it would be valueless?
No, I think it hires hundreds of thousands of people, and it's it's a big company. I don't know a lot about that particular company, but I know it's a
Look,
tech company.
Steve Jobs died. Okay.
Yeah.
Is Apple valueless?
No,
Let's not pretend that these creators are the sole reason these companies are valuable.
sure.
And what we're talking about in many cases,
But-
I was a trader, okay? And I'm worth millions of quid. And, now that is just assets. I just own the assets. I own the assets. And that will grow and it will grow and it will grow and it will grow. And that will squeeze out and squeeze out and squeeze out and squeeze out our viewers. And I'll give that to my kids. They don't even need to work. They wouldn't even have to work. They could just live on, I could live off the wealth.
It sounds like Gary needs to donate some of his wealth to those who can't afford their heating bills or their electricity. I actually heard him on, I think it was Piers Morgan, and I think it was Dave Rubin, sort of point blank said, well, what do you donate to the people who are struggling? And he said, well, I never claimed to be a good person. I don't donate anything. Like, what on earth? Like, donate some of it then. I'm looking at you. You want to know what I think is fair? Well, I'm looking at you as someone that's claimed to be a multimillionaire thinking, well, that's not fair. I should have some of Gary's wealth. Donate it to me. Utterly ridiculous.
Yeah, this is something I was going to pick up on, a bit later as well, but I think it's probably a good time to do it now. I have no issue with someone who wants the sort of tax regulations that he seems to want, making money and keeping some of it for themselves and doing good for their family and that kind of thing. I don't have an issue with him selling a book. I think that's fine. You can make money. He can justify that by saying, well, I'm hoping that people read it and it spreads a message and gets people into movement. But part of me thinks, well, you're selling on Amazon. Why do you not go to only local independent bookshops?
Yeah.
You've got enough of a name whereby if people want that book, they will go somewhere to get it.
Yeah.
So why not? Generally, most independent bookshop owners are not as wealthy as Jeff Bezos.
No,
If you would like to redistribute wealth, don't sell your book on Amazon, do it there.
exactly.
The other thing, as we're watching this for research, I thought, I'm going to check and see if his YouTube is monetized. He runs ads at the start of his YouTube videos. Now, I could be wrong. He could be giving that money to charity. My guess is he probably isn't.
Well, I don't think he is. If he's been asked outright, do you donate? And he's outright said, no, I don't donate money. I don't think he is donating to the people he's speaking about.
And he says, I don't care about making more money. Well, a very simple thing to do then is turn off ads on your YouTube.
Or no, I would take the profit and then donate it.
And again, I don't even have an issue with someone who is speaking like him actually making money and saying,
No.
yes, I want to make money because I want to do good things for my family. It's when someone says, I believe other people should be taxed more, and then you're not doing things to redistribute wealth for yourself. And a lot of people will say, oh, like, why are you standing up for the super rich people? And I've seen that put in comments on YouTube and on Instagram and stuff, and people saying about, oh, all you sort of middle class people who think you're wealthy, actually you're not. You're the disenfranchised that he's talking about, and you're sticking up for the multi-billionaires. Like, I don't particularly have any strong feelings about billionaires. I think for the most part, they've worked quite hard to have what they've got. And I don't like a system whereby the government comes in and decides what is a fair amount you should keep. I think that's horrendous. I'm a small government person. But I just find that such a nonsensical argument as well. And it's just as emotive as everything else that's being said here.
Yeah, I agree. I think the idea, our views differ slightly around it. We've talked over the dinner table. I don't think a certain level of wealth is really needed up into your hundreds of billions of pounds, or dollars. However, I completely agree that the idea of taking that away from someone who's built something and giving it to a government, like, that just is not possible. It cannot be done. Or rather, it should not be done. To dictate this person can only have this much money and therefore it's going to be taken from them and distributed X, Y, Z. For me, this bit, though, it just really hits home, I think, or it should hit home to so many people as to why Gary is not genuine and is not, in my opinion, and is not really doing this for the good of people. Because if he did, I would expect to see a lot more points, actionable points, really having thought through how things can be implemented to help people, rather than just shouting random claims about tax, wealth, economics, I'm the best trader, I place bets. I would expect to see a really thought out plan. But what I would also hope to see is that he actually does donate some of that wealth. You talked there about listing his book on Amazon. If I was so against the wealth that billionaires were hoarding and so for the taxation or heavy taxation on them, I would never, ever be listing my book on Amazon. I wouldn't be having my audiobook on Spotify, which is what I listened to it on the way up here. Never in a million years. And you're completely right about the monetization of YouTube. You probably know better than I do. That's going to be hundreds of thousands on a million, million subscribers, or
we'll be making at least 6 figures a year, if not 7.
Yeah. So that really is for me the crux of it. That is it a money making scheme? Is it? Right, just to sort of play into the struggles of working and middle-class British people and the US. Now it seems he's realised that actually if he monetises the US, that's an even bigger pool of people. That idea that if you play into their struggles and make people feel, from a marketing perspective, you being the great marketer here, that's a great tactic, to play into people's struggles. But then to do so and to profit from that, without donating any of it, it just is incredibly, disingenuous.
The triple whammy would be that if he also drives a Tesla, which I have no idea whether he does or not. I'm just looking up a quote on my phone while we do this, but this might be a good point to touch on sort of his background as a trader as well. And I will say this as someone who's not read his book, I'm happy to say that. But I know that we've had talks about how he claims to be the best trader, and that's so ambiguous. It's like there's no league table for traders. The bonuses that the money he made, or he says he made, which I've got no reason to disbelieve, people get bigger bonuses than that every year. Granted, it's not a huge thing. There's not a lot of people who do that, but they do. And I know there was a Financial Times article that it could be argued it was just written by bitter people, but they talked to people at his old firm, and they were like, I kind of knew of him, but he wasn't anything special when he was here. I don't know if your experience in the city is...
I don't know how their sort of data on the individual traders in that world works. It's very unlikely, if it's anything like the world that I'm in, it's very unlikely that it's actively published. We don't have anything like that as to do with our performance on portfolios to say, well, I'm the best investment manager, other than if you're running a fund, you'll get your performance of the fund, and then you might be able to say, well, I'm the best fund manager because I've outperformed XYZ benchmark. In the trading world, I don't know, but I highly doubt there's going to be some sort of league table, even if it's within particular firms. I doubt there's anything that's out there to say, I am the best. But would he have gained so much attention, and would his book have so much traction by saying, well, I worked in trading and earned pretty well, in my view, pretty well for a few years and then quit? Does that sell books, and does that make your story as exciting? No, not really.
Well, it's very much like there's a guy called Brad Burton who admits that he just came up with the phrase that he was the UK's #1 motivational speaker, and now he's known as that. So he just made it up. The quote I was looking for there is from Blair Warren, and it's, People will do anything for those who encourage their dreams, justify their failures, allay their fears, confirm their suspicions, and help them throw rocks at their enemies. I don't think Gary does the first one of those, but he definitely does the whole failures, fears, suspicions, and enemies ones. And I think that's partly why he's got getting so much traction, because he does that very negative style of marketing that makes people feel, oh, it's not, this might sound harsh, but it makes them feel it's absolutely not my fault for the situation I'm in. I can hand off responsibility for anything bad that's happened to basically rich, or again, not even rich people, anyone who earns more than me.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's go for next bit.
No.
Let's not pretend that these creators are the sole reason these companies are valuable.
Sure.
You know, and what we're talking about in many cases, you know, I was a trader, okay? And I'm worth millions of quid. And, you know, now that is just assets. I just own the assets. I own the assets. And that will grow and it will grow and it will grow and it will grow. And that will squeeze out and squeeze out and squeeze out and squeeze out our viewers. And I'll give that to my kids. They don't even need to work. They wouldn't even have to work. They could just live on, I could live on off the wealth. Is that what you want?
Do you think there are any opportunities for people today? Like, if you're born into a poor family, do you think it's possible that housing being shit, and we can both agree on that, but do you think there are new opportunities that didn't exist for our parents or grandparents, but they do exist for people today?
I think the reality is, for kids from poor backgrounds, it is almost impossible to realistically get even financial security, never mind wealth.
But why do you think you could do it, I could do it, he could do it, but you don't think other people could do it?
Well, the first thing is I'm 38 now, so I'm not a kid nowadays. Listen, I won every maths competition I've ever been in, you know what I mean, since I was a little kid. I didn't even have a desk in my house, you know. I was one of the top students at LSE, and I still had to win my job by cheating in the card game. You know, that's the world that we live in. I don't think that's a very replicable strategy. And look, it's very easy for people like us who've made money to say, oh, we did it, aren't we great? Go out and, you know, you've said that you think if young people go and work in tech business, they can get financial security. If it was that easy, they'd all be doing it. You know, they're not idiots. Our viewers are not idiots. They're trying. They're trying. They want to find the good opportunities, and they work. Listen, they're
I'm
working
not the one
so
saying
hard.
they're idiots. You're the one who says that they can't do it anymore. I see people do it all the time. Like, I'm working in entrepreneur.
People from poor backgrounds.
Poor backgrounds.
But then why are our viewers? You think all of our? If it was that easy, why is everybody not doing it?
I'll tell you why people aren't doing it. We went through a schooling system that taught us how to get an office job.
Okay.
Right. We went through a schooling system to prepare us for a world that doesn't really exist anymore, which is the Industrial Revolution world. And you have to go through a process of figuring out how it really works. Okay. So what I see is the most often the people who do really well financially who are young, they dropped out of school, they dropped out of university, they started learning how to do things by doing their own research. They start their own business or co-found a business. They take a very alternative path. None of that was taught to us at school. None of it's taught to us in normal society. We have a school system that manufactures people for a set of skills that are not particularly valuable anymore. Yeah. And we also get them in debt for those skills. When people sidestep that and say, okay, I'm not going to get into university debt, I'm just going to go off and actually figure out how the world works, there's actually loads of opportunities.
Okay, so I guess we've sorted it then.
I just think Dan's entirely right. In terms of opportunities, there's never been more. And that's not to say there aren't hardships and difficulties as well. But I think this whole attitude of almost it's not worth trying, I just cannot understand that. I mean, both you and I came from, I guess, middle-class backgrounds. So we were quite fortunate in that respect. I mean, you went to university, I didn't. But we both had parents who certainly didn't spoil us, I wouldn't say, but we never went without anything we needed. I know my parents, I feel very lucky my parents both supported me in doing whatever I wanted. They're very much in the frame of mind of, if you don't want to go to uni, that's fine. Pursue what you want to do. We've got faith in you that you'll make it work. And I know not everyone has that, but it just, it feels incredibly defeatist to say that it's almost not worth people trying, people from poor backgrounds. And neither of us can speak firsthand on that. But again, I know that a whole lot of people I know have come from a less privileged background than me.
Yeah, I think you're right. Completely defeatist, and it's also so incredibly egotistical to say, "Well, I did it, but that's because I'm special. So don't bother trying because you won't." It's really quite a hideous message to be sharing. And you said there about the sort of middle class backgrounds. Yeah, very lucky to have had lots of nice hobbies when I was younger and things like this. But I'm the granddaughter of a Glaswegian bus driver. Let's not like sort of mince about the working class background. And as I said before, like you got my accent wrong, or you kind of got my background a bit wrong based on my accent. And maybe we can do that with Gary as well. Who knows? But the idea that people can't improve where they've come, they can't improve their financial circumstances, their stability, all of this is absolute nonsense. You're proof of it. Stephen, who's here in the studio, is proof of it. I'm proof of it. There is no reason why Gary can't use his experience and the knowledge that he's gained, if he brushes up a little bit, to teach people. And I actually watched one of his YouTube videos whereby people had said, "Could you teach me to trade?" And he said, "No, it's too hard. You won't be able to do it." Or that was how I understood the message he was giving, was I was special, that's why I can do it and why I understood it, but it's really hard and you won't be able to do it. Trading is incredibly high risk and it's very short term. So it's not something I personally do, and I don't think most people should sort of dabble into it. He's correct there that there is risks to it. But the idea that people can't improve their circumstances is completely false. And it's playing into, we talked about it earlier, it's playing into this pessimistic idea of things to keep people down. And it's almost the biggest con. It's a bigger con than the government telling us that, a 50k income is a lot of money. It's not. Sorry, but living off of 50k, I think if all of us tried it, we'd struggle. So it's not a lot of money. That's the biggest con from our government. And one of the biggest cons that we're seeing here is Gary telling everyone that they can't do better.
It's the whole victim mindset. And that for me is one of my big issues with the UK as well. And it's why, as you'll know, for a lot of masterminds and seminars and anything business related, I much prefer to go to America because, yeah, you can argue that Americans are a bit sort of pie in the sky. There's almost a very positive naivety to an extent. They're a lot less skeptical than we are in Britain. But I think this sort of attitude just exacerbates the negative culture that we have over here. Very much a tall poppy syndrome, crabs in a bucket, whatever you want to call it, of if I see people doing well, not I want to lift myself up to be like them, but I want to be like them by bringing them down. And I can't stand it. And I think what annoys me so much, he's got such a huge platform now. He has so much potential to improve literally millions of people's lives. And he's, as far as I can see, not doing it.
Yeah, and I think the financial literacy point is a huge one that's really important to me, coming from the background that I have. I moved into the investment world, moved into the city just after university because I realised there was this whole other world that was running what I call the civilian world, and I wanted to understand it. Did I have to graft to get into it? Yes. And was I pretty much out of place and continue to be so? Yes. I am. Gary thinks it's tough being a Cockney bloke in the Canary Wharf where he was. Well, try being a woman, or the only woman in a room full of 20 men who are quite aggressive with their opinions. Come and try that. So I didn't come from a background where I understood economics, finance, investments. They were never talked about in my home, other than save for a pension, which was great advice from my mum, which was passed on from her father. It wasn't something that I was privy to in the household. And at school, other than doing maths, that's all we did. Gary, you're right, he's got a great platform and he could, if he wanted to, use it to improve financial literacy, to help people see, where society is going wrong. I talk to you about it a lot with what we prioritise in terms of materialistic things, how we invest, how we don't invest, crucially, is one of the biggest issues. And I'm like him. I've come from a background where I didn't have access to these sorts of things and somehow broke into the city. I grafted my way in. I also wasn't meant to be there, or didn't look like or didn't sound like I was meant to be there. Gary thinks it's tough being being a Cockney bloke on the trading floor. Well, try being a woman in a room of 20 men on the dealing floor. Thanks. That's tough too. But we can all learn more about financial literacy than what the government is currently teaching us. That's a massive failing of the government. But Gary could use the platform to improve that. Instead, he tells people to stay down and keep down.
Which plays into Daniel's point about it's a failing schooling system.
Yeah.
And you and I have talked a lot about that in terms of kids are taught to pass exams. There's very little in the way of practical knowledge, like whether it's health, whether it's cooking, running a home, finances, running a business, all that kind of thing. And that is more a fix the system type thing, which I'm certainly, I think change happens a lot faster when you fix things at an individual level. So I think fixing the schooling system's longer term thing. Yeah. But that's why people like Gary could be using their platforms for individual knowledge, put together a free finance course that anyone under 16 can do. Anyone can do. Well, it doesn't have to have an age on it. But
rather than telling them that he was just special, really good at maths, went to LSE, and that's the only reason why he can do it.
Yeah, exactly.
All of our viewers need to do is go and buy Dan's book, become an entrepreneur and become a millionaire. It's that easy. Why weren't you guys doing it to begin with? They're idiots. The viewers are idiots. They should be just being more entrepreneurial. It's as simple as that. More entrepreneurial, start a business. Listen, I come from East London, okay? My friends can't feed their kids, okay? And if it was as simple as going out and being an entrepreneur, I can bet you they would do it. I'm sick of multimillionaires telling kids who can't afford to turn the heating on, you just need to be more entrepreneurial. It's sick, Dan. It's sick. But this gives people mental illness. It gives people mental illness. Tell them the truth, okay? We, your older generation, we took the opportunities and now it is almost impossible to get out of poverty. And don't just stand up there and wave, your millions of pounds in front of them and say, if you were entrepreneurial like me, you could do it, you could have it. Because it's sick because they can't. They can't feed their kids, Dan. They can't turn the heating on. Don't tell them to be more entrepreneurial. Fix the system that drives more and more and more of them into poverty every generation.
That wasn't going to be where I paused there. Well, there's another clip I wanted to do first, but that's just a perfect example of arguing emotively. There's no substance in that whatsoever. And it's just this, he's putting words in Daniel's mouth. It's like
he was doing that the whole interview, the whole discussion.
But I've never heard, and this is something that annoys me, that the vast, vast, vast majority of wealthy business owners that I've spoken to are more than happy to share their knowledge. I was amazed. The first time I went to a proper mastermind, it was kind of a few grand a ticket. I was by far and away the poorest person in that room. Everyone else doing like 7, 8, 9 figures a year. You would go and chat to them. They'd want to share what they were doing. And it was not, you just need to be more entrepreneurial. Yeah. It was like, here's what we're doing that's working now. Here's how I got my first break. Daniel talks about he worked for a co-founder for a year to start off. That was how he did it. And he just hustled and, picked up stuff. It's like, yeah, I just really struggle with that. There will be business owners out there who look down on people who aren't entrepreneurial and who say it's easy, you just need to do it. And yeah, there will be wealthy business owners who do keep their cards close to their chest. They do say not everyone can do it. They look down their nose at people who aren't entrepreneurial, and they will give very sort of standoffish advice like just be more entrepreneurial. But I don't want to draw on anecdotal evidence, but I just don't really see that. And I think there's so many free resources out there. It's not even about being entrepreneurial. I think that's a misinterpretation as well of like, you can do well working for someone else. Yeah. You can have a side hustle business. Like more and more people are doing that. They're thinking, I've got something I really enjoy doing. How can I monetize that a bit? I enjoy bike repair. Can I fix a couple of bikes a week for a couple £100? Yeah. Like it's not mega bucks, but that's enough to make a massive difference for most people. So this idea that people would do it if it was that simple, I think people, they are doing it. And secondly, it's not an us versus them thing. Entrepreneurs aren't, being mean and nasty by hoarding wealth. They generally want other people to do well.
Yeah, and I think, just playing into the sort of pessimism of things that Gary's done throughout this discussion on other platforms is a way to uninspire people. When I listen to all of these podcasts and read books, and I feel more inspired for things, for life improvements, for health, for mental health, wealth, everything. And I love consuming, as you say, these free resources. You don't even need to pay for them. And that's inspiring and gives people hope. When people don't have hope, that's when they go into mental health struggles a lot of the time around this sort of thing.
Yeah, that was actually the initial point I was going to make as well, is this whole, it gives people mental health issues. I mean, that is just false. Like, I'm a strong believer that very, very, very few individual things can give people mental health issues. There will be variety of things that do that. It'll be, if we're talking about mental health, it's an actual illness. It's not like you give someone a cold necessarily. I just think that it's a very nasty thing to say as well. And I think it's just perpetuating the victim mindset of it.
Control over your circumstances until the world changes the whole economic system.
I never told people don't work hard. I never once said that. Never once said that.
You said if your dad wasn't rich, you'll never be rich.
Which is true in 99.9% of cases. I've never told people don't work
That's
hard.
actually
I've
not
never
true in
told people-
99%
listen,
of cases.
I've never told people don't work hard, okay? And listen, if you think that Ugandans should be more entrepreneurial, I've never been to Uganda, maybe that's the problem out there, maybe that's the problem in Nigeria, maybe that's the problem in India. Listen, I've never said don't work hard, okay? When I brought my book out last year, the hardback, I was at some event and I come out, I was drinking in London Bridge. And I come out late, it was like 1 a.m. And some guy come up to me when I was unlocking my bike. Some guy from Newcastle, which is the northeast of England. It's this quite poor town. There's a lot of working class people there. And he said, I've been watching you on YouTube and I love your stuff. And this guy started crying. This guy started crying on the street, right, in front of me. He's like, I work so hard, Gary. I work 2 jobs. My mum's sick and I'm trying to help, I'm trying to support and I don't understand why. And I'm sorry that I'm crying, but nobody ever told me that it wasn't my fault before.
So the rich dad thing amuses me there because 99% is clearly just a made up statistic and it's also factually incorrect. I've not done the very latest research on this, but I remember a couple of years ago, I looked this up because I'd had a debate with someone where they said about it's very difficult to get wealthy if you don't come from a rich family. And it was something like 6 in 7 millionaires in the UK are first generation. So their parents weren't millionaires. Now, the counterpoint to that is, well, their parents could have still been very wealthy. They could have been well off. They could have been upper middle class, all that kind of stuff. And I'm not disagreeing with that at all. But I think that goes a long way to show that it's not a case that you've only got a 1% chance of being rich if your parents were rich. It's just it's an absolute falsehood, really. And Daniel went to correct him and then he just moved on quickly, which seemed to be a tactic going through the whole debate of here's this thing that I'm going to claim as fact. Daniel says it's not fact, I've got the proof. Gary then changes the argument. And it's a very common debating
talks louder, shouts louder.
Yeah, it's that whole he who shouts loudest wins the argument, which I think is what he's trying to do, and he just deflects. It's very much when Daniel brings in a point that is going to factually disprove him, he changes the goalpost. It becomes anecdotal, it becomes emotive, all that kind of stuff.
Puts words in Daniel's mouth that Daniel never said.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. That's another tactic that's often done. Is the whole so you think so and so. I'm going to paraphrase what you said, dumb it down, give it an ulterior motive, and then to people who like me, that's going to sound like I'm being smart and witty and catching you out. When in actual fact, if you're listening, it just makes you look a bit daft.
You can see the headline now, can't you? Yeah. Gary destroys Daniel.
And I believe that outlets like Novara Media have already had that video,
really?
which is not surprising. It's just not a good debating style. I don't think it puts him in a good light because he could argue his point a lot better.
Like we want to hear those points.
Yeah, we
want to hear the data and the points behind that.
Yeah, there are economists who are more, whether you call it left wing, Keynesian, whether they're more big government, who I think can make good points very well. I largely disagree with them. But at the same time, they can put across an eloquent argument. It's not like this.
Well, I mean, I just want to stop you there, Mike. Studying economics at LSE doesn't make you an economist. Being a trader for an investment bank doesn't make you an economist. I've sat in rooms with some of the best economists in the world, and they can reel off numbers, percentages, they can pull out graphs like that. So, just doing economics, I'm afraid, Gary, at LSE, even if you did get a first, well, I got a first in history. I'm not a historian.
And I suppose we've all seen it. When you look at someone who is seen to be an expert in your field, and you yourself can see that actually there are lots of things they say that aren't correct, but people who aren't familiar with that field will think, well, here's a business owner versus an economist on the economy. Who's going to be right? Oh, it must be the economist. Whereas you can have in academia, and I'm not even saying academia is the gold standard, but you can have 2 historians who disagree greatly on things. You can have, 2 scientists who disagree greatly on certain issues. It doesn't, as you say, it doesn't make you an expert. It doesn't make you right just because you've done that degree and then done the job for a while.
And I think that that is so key to the popularity. It's first of all what I talked about earlier about playing into the pessimism and people's sense of desperation, which is really incredibly a sad thing to do as a tactic. But it's also because this world of financial services is so unknown and has perhaps been gatekept for far too long. The likes of Gary, who have some sort of background from it, are therefore, yeah, you're right, they kind of become the expert. And I think that's why I found it so frustrating watching things like this, because I speak his language. Wasn't a trader, I'm not a trader, but come from that sort of career world. And I've spoken to the most eloquent people in the world around economics, geopolitics, personal finance, investing, like the brightest, the most successful people. Gary was never in the room. Never. And so I can see when someone is, in my belief, lying or peddling a story just for their own personal success, for those gold coins to start stacking up as they do if you've got very good YouTube ad revenue.
And my final point is one we've touched on already, but it's that story at the end. It's a really good story. And as someone who's involved in copywriting, marketing, all that kind of thing, I know the power of a good story. And so that will resonate really hard with people, that we get an image in our head. It's not just numbers. It's this person, can't afford a car, so he's on his bike. He's from a poor coal mining town in the northeast and all that kind of stuff. And it's a great narrative, but it's also just one example, and it's not one to disagree with. It may be representative of a large portion of society, and almost certainly is. But this idea that to give that person advice of, well, we just need to tax rich people more, that's fine, but when's that going to kick in, and when is he going to get the downstream benefits of that? If he ever does, it's going to be literally years. And so what would be the more helpful thing for him? Would it be, oh, actually, yeah, sorry, mate, you're in a bit of a crap situation and it's not your fault, but we just need to tax rich people more. Wait it out 10 years if you don't die of the cold or dysentery or malnutrition before that. Or would it be, do you know what? Actually, what do you love doing? I love doing so and so. Oh, have you ever thought about starting a bit of a side hustle for that? There'd be a market there. You get yourself on social media. You could do this and that. You could put up flyers in your local town. I think people overcomplicate starting a business, and it's not to say it's easy because you have to work hard, but it generally can be quite simple. And not to say everyone should do that, not to say everyone can do that. But this is a point Daniel gets to later on by saying that he doesn't say that everyone should be an entrepreneur. It's more like if you want to be and if you have the capability to do it, you should have the fewest barriers possible. And for me, if people want to change their circumstances, this is my whole world ethos, is that, yes, there is shit stuff that happens that you can't control. What can you control? Well, you've got personal agency to a degree. That degree varies for all of us, but there will be something you can do today to make a bit more money, make your life a bit better. Again, I'll caveat this, I'm speaking from a good position. I've got no qualms in saying that, but I just don't think his advice to people is in any way useful whatsoever.
I agree.
Thank you very much for joining, guys. I hope you have enjoyed that one. Really interested to hear comments as well, so post them down below. I'm sure we'll have a lot of people disagreeing with us, which is absolutely fine. Make your points, be as eloquent as you want with them. We both encourage debate. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed that being a bit of a different episode today. Victoria, anywhere you want people to go to check you out and see more of your stuff?
Yeah, well, I am on Instagram at Everywhere Victoria Goes, which is more of a kind of just what I'm up to type of Instagram page. It happens to be public, but it's just a bit of everything that I do. And I also have a newsletter, so people are welcome to reach out via Instagram if they'd like to be added to the newsletter. It's weekly, comes out on a Sunday, and it tries to really provide the financial literacy around personal finance, investing, economics, geopolitics that is so vitally missing in today's world.
Love it. Obviously, I'm very biased, but I'd say it's an excellent newsletter as well. So yeah, definitely follow Victoria on Instagram. I'll put the link in the description. Send her a message and you can add people on, I assume.
Yeah, great.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you.
So again, thank you again, guys. I'll put all the normal links in the description as well. Likes, comments, subscribe, shares, all that kind of stuff. Send it to a Gary Stevenson fan. Send it to a Gary Stevenson hater. Let us know any comments and I'll catch you on the next normal episode.